Welcome to the Arms Control Primer, a podcast by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I am your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control, based in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments on the most critical issues. Whether you are new to the topic or need a refresher, please join us in our exploration of the nuclear past, present, and future. In this season, we examine the histories and policies of countries that may have had nuclear weapons ambitions or even nuclear arsenals and gave them up. We search for lessons for non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament. I hope it helps you better know a non-nuke.
After the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine turned to be the country which managed to possess in one or the other way the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. There were more than 2,000 of tactical nuclear warheads, 1,800 strategic nuclear warheads, and heavy bombers. And Ukraine could not use this arsenal directly, except the tactical nuclear weapons.
The nuclear shadow has hung over the war in Ukraine since the very start of the invasion. Russia is a massive nuclear power, and Putin has made that very clear from the very start of the invasion, that Russia would not hesitate to resort to the full scope of its capabilities, which of course include a very large nuclear arsenal.
The Russian Federation escalated its campaign against Ukraine with a full-scale invasion in February 2022. Russia has used nuclear threats to minimize Western support for Ukraine, the country that inherited a significant portion of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. In this episode, we go back in time to understand why Ukraine gave up these weapons, why it signed the Budapest Memorandum, and why it joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state. To help us understand this nuclear history and the role of nuclear weapons and other nuclear dangers in the war in Ukraine today, we are joined by Dr. Polina Sinovets and Darya Dolzikova.
I'm Polina Sinovets, the head of Odessa Center for Non-Proliferation. Currently, I'm mostly focusing on the questions of European security, strategic stability, extended deterrence, future of European deterrence under the developing circumstances, of course, Russian nuclear policy, and especially Russian nuclear strategy and Russian nuclear deterrence, coercion strategy during the Russia's war in Ukraine. It has been a very big part of our work on the book Ukraine's Nuclear History, which was published by Springer in 2022. And the first chapter was exactly dedicated to the nuclear history of Ukraine during the Soviet times. Here, I would like to say something briefly about the role of Ukrainian Institute for Physics and Technology. Shortly speaking, UIPIT. The UIPIT was the cradle of nuclear physics in the Soviet Union, in a way, because the experiments splitting the nucleus of lithium was actually the second in the world. I think the first was taking place only in the UK. Also, they were making this pulse generator, and later during the Second World War, when Nazis came to occupy Ukraine, they spent a couple of months in the UPIT just to investigate how they could use this research for the future, making the X-rays cannon. The UPIT were authoring such technology as the centrifuge-based technology for the uranium-235 enrichment, because mostly it was different from the technology Americans used. And after the Second World War, it turned to be much more efficient. However, because during the 1930s, the Soviet regime was killing all the outstanding people, the UIPIT was not an exception anyhow. A lot of physics were prosecuted, were sent away, and were killed. And this is why a lot of heritage of UIPIT was not really used by the Soviet industry. Also, it's interesting to say that most of the physicists which were working there, Landau, Lipunsky, Gamov, Hotermans, were not only Russian physicists or Ukrainian physicists, they were of international camp. And for example, Lipunsky, who was the head of UIPIT for a couple of years in the 1930s, he managed to attract the leading physicists of Europe for different international conferences. And it was not really surprising that when Soviet Union back in 1940s started to really think about creating the nuclear weapons program, there was a big argument in the Soviet circles where to make this hard for the Soviet nuclear program, whether it should be closer to Moscow or in UIPIT, because the necessary infrastructure already existed in UIPIT. But probably because of the fact that Stalin was incredibly suspicious and because he probably wanted to control the Soviet program much more attentively and closely, as well as Darya, who was the manager of the Soviet nuclear atomic project. This is why the final decision was made to make this new laboratory in Sarov, close to Moscow. But UIP had much more opportunities for that because they have invented this centrifuge isotope separation method for uranium-235. And also because in 1940s, just because the Manhattan Project was established, the physicists from UIP, Viktor Spinel and Vladimir Maslov, they already started to think about the necessity to build a nuclear bomb just before Hitler, because of course it was the general concern for everyone. And Maslov and Spinel, they wrote the report to Moscow, to the Soviet Politburo, which was called The Use of Uranium as the Explosive and the Poison, where they were describing the necessity and the possibility that uranium-235 can be used as the main material to create the nuclear bomb. The design of first nuclear bomb was suggested by Maslov and Spinel in 1940s. It was kind of complete design in this report. However, of course, in Moscow, nobody really was thinking about the possibility of using nuclear elements as a weapons. At that point, nobody was really caring about that. And they said that there were some mistakes or inconsistencies in this project. And there probably were some inconsistencies, like sharp angles, but the basic design, which Maslov and Spinel suggested, was the very proper design of the nuclear bomb. However, of course, that main Soviet nuclear program, they were lagging behind the United States very much because they didn't care about the possibility of using uranium for the bomb. And only when Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened, Stalin gave an order to accelerate works on the bomb. And then the first Soviet bomb was stolen from the Americans. The design was stolen from the English Americans because it was given by Klaus Fuchs, the German physicist who worked in the Manhattan Project. And it was the copy of the Fat Man made by Americans, while Maslov and Spinel suggested the fission-based nuclear bomb. So it was a very different design. It was that design which was maybe closer to the little boy made by Americans, but it was very independent research. And if Soviets really proceeded with the ideas of Maslov and Spinel, then by 1945, they would probably also have nuclear bomb. After the war, he received this patent for inventing the atomic bomb, but there was not that much. I mean, it would be a reassuring award, but it didn't anyhow compensate the fact that the Soviet Union didn't use that capability. The other physicist, Maslov, he was killed during the Second World War, but Spinel later was participating in the Soviet nuclear program. The UIP was also involved as a part of the Soviet nuclear program. It was so-called Laboratory Number 1, where they made secret works complementing Soviet nuclear program regarding the uranium centrifuging, the split of nucleus. Later, also, Soviet Union, they started to call it Kharkiv Institute of Physics and Technology after the Second World War, and it was also involved in the Soviet thermonuclear program as well. The Kharkiv Institute brought a lot of important expertise and research to the Soviet nuclear program, and unfortunately, it was not enough used by the Soviets just because of that fear and all these repressions. We know that there were several physicists there. Friedrich Hottermans, the famous German physicist who was involved in the German nuclear program later. And in 30s, he was working for the UIP. But then, because many of physicists, Soviet, Germans, Austrians, they were arrested by the Soviet NKVD. Many of them, they were prosecuted, but because Hottermans, he was blamed that he was the agent of Gestapo. But of course, at that moment, he was just working for the Soviet Institute. But it was very typical, an allegation, if you were German at that moment. So he was arrested by NKVD, but to his luck, later he was not prosecuted, but he was exchanged with Germans for some Soviet agents. And then later he started to work with Ardennes Institute, who worked for the German nuclear program. And this is why Germans came in when they occupied Kharkiv in 1940s, in the beginning. They came to look for some developments of UAPs just because Hottermans knew that there were a lot of interesting information which could be later involved in the German nuclear program. There was a very rich heritage of Kharkiv's contribution, and also later people from Kharkiv were brought to Kiev, which also had a nuclear institute, laboratories for supporting Soviet nuclear program, civil as well as the military one. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine turned to be the country which managed to possess in one or the other way the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. There were more than 2,000 of tactical nuclear warheads, 1,800 strategic nuclear warheads, and heavy bombers. So it was enough. Of course, Ukraine could not use this arsenal directly, except the tactical nuclear weapons, because this is very important. Sometimes the relevance of the tactical nuclear weapons are missed because the operational control over strategic nuclear weapons, it belonged to the Russian authorities then. And without sending this order, nobody could really use it. But on the other hand, the permissive action link, which was connected with the tactical nuclear weapons, they started to be established on the Russian nuclear weapons already in the beginning of 1990s. There is all reasons to believe that, according to the declassified documents, that the tactical nuclear weapons which Ukraine possessed at the territory was usable by any field commander. And this is why Russians were incredibly concerned about withdrawing these tactical nuclear weapons from Ukraine as fast as possible. And this is why it was such a big scandal in February 1992, when President Kravchuk suddenly stopped the withdrawal of tactical nuclear weapons of Ukraine to Russia. Because before that, there was the agreement, according to Belavesh Agreement, Almaty Agreement, and others, Ukraine and other former Soviet states, they had to withdraw tactical nuclear weapons to the Russian territory by summer 1992. So when in February Kravchuk stopped the withdrawal of tactical nuclear weapons, it was a big scandal. Even Russian commanders were sending all these mad letters full of anger, saying that if Ukrainians would not withdraw, we will destroy it on the territory of Ukraine. So it was a big concern in Russia that something happens. Because following that decision of Kravchuk to stop the withdrawal, in April, Verkhovna Rada, they adopted the decree that Ukraine has the administrative property over these nuclear weapons. And this is why nobody could actually withdraw it without the decision of Verkhovna Rada or the president. And the interesting moment of history here was that in June 1992, when Kravchuk was visiting Washington, he suddenly got the greetings from the American journalists that Ukraine has finished the withdrawal of tactical nuclear weapons to Russia. And Kravchuk was shocked because he never ordered to renew the withdrawal. And then he asked Verkhovna Rada, because Verkhovna Rada had this decree to control these assets like nuclear weapons. And Verkhovna Rada also didn't have any idea. And then MFA as well. And then they asked the Minister of Defense, which was the Minister of Defense formed still during the Soviet Union times, where most of the generals, they were, of course, connected with Moscow and so on. And then the Minister of Defense said that because there was a technical problem in the relationship of Russia and Ukraine, because initially Kravchuk stopped withdrawal of tactical nuclear weapons because of the pretext that Ukraine got the information that these nuclear weapons will not be destroyed by Russia, but will be used. And it was logical because Ukraine possessed new tactical nuclear weapons, while tactical nuclear weapons which were stationed in Russia, they were pretty old and outdated. So it was pretty logical that Russia would use them, but because Ukraine wanted to stop the withdrawal, they used it as a pretext. However, because in April, Russia made this kind of formal agreement with Ukraine that it will destroy all the withdrawn tactical nuclear weapons under the control of the Ukrainian Commission. So this was the document, but this document didn't cause automatic renewal of withdrawal of nuclear weapons because some order should have followed, like the order of the president or the order of the parliament, that because of this document, the withdrawal should be renewed. However, Minister of Defense said that because there was a document, we used our control over these weapons just to withdraw them to Russia. Personally, I had the interview with Leonid Kravchuk, the first president of Ukraine, who said that I thought that I was controlling these tactical nuclear weapons, but it turned out that probably it was more controlled by the Commonwealth of Independent States Army than by myself, which I didn't know, which is, of course, a shame. But Ukraine was a young, independent country and everything was in mass. But after the withdrawal of tactical nuclear weapons, I think that Russia and the world could be pretty sure that Ukraine would not be able to use any other weapons deployed at the territory of Ukraine. However, what is also important here that Ukraine was not that quick to give up nuclear weapons, unlike Russia and Belarus. And the first ratification of the START 1 treaty, which was a part of the whole deal, which had this part as a Budapest Memorandum, which Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan had to sign as non-nuclear state, joining the NPT. First, Ukraine ratified it in November 1993, having crossed the articles about joining the NPT as non-nuclear state. So actually, Ukraine has signed the treaty on the same conditions as Russia and the United States, promising to get rid of the 36% of its missile arsenal and 45% of its nuclear weapons arsenal, which also was a big scandal because Ukraine has become the young democratic country with a new parliament, which was not subordinated to some party officials. And this parliament, they sincerely didn't understand why should Ukraine give up that kind of big wealth, big asset just for free because Russia wants it or because the United States wants it. This is why they just didn't want to do it for free. They just didn't want to give up everything at the moment when Ukraine was suffering from the strong economic problems and also international pressure. And this is why the main idea was to slow down this process of disarmament and then to somehow maybe to give it up, but not that quickly. But at the end, with the change of US administration from Bush to Clinton, things changed also because the attitude of the US administration changed completely. Because if Bush administration told that keep these weapons, it's not yours, you have no right, you have stolen it, Clinton administration was very respecting. And the main order and the main instruction of Clinton administration how to deal with Ukraine was just give them whatever they want, whenever they want, as much as they want, to persuade them that we share their concerns, that their way they are withdrawing nuclear weapons will not be for free. Also, the program of non-nuke was suggested. There was a lot of promises that Ukraine's voice is heard, that Ukraine's opinion is considered, and that Ukraine is a full-fledged partner in negotiations, a similar full-fledged partner as Russia. And coming to the Budapest Memorandum, this is why Ukraine, already under the different President Kuchma, managed to adopt the law on the non-nuclear status, which is also a very interesting law before signing Budapest Memorandum. Which is also a very interesting law because it is very much connected with the Article 10 of NPT, which tells that this is our nuclear weapons, we give them up, but in case if some extraordinary circumstances emerge, we may withdraw a decision and withdraw a membership from NPT. So very much complying with the Article 10 of NPT when if the extreme threat to the security of the state or jeopardizes the vital security, and this is why the state may withdraw. And therefore, we managed to join the Budapest Memorandum. Also, the Budapest Memorandum took place, and then it's probably also connected with the bureaucratic politics. What is interesting there is that, of course, the Ukrainian parliament, besides some material compensation for disarmament, they also very strongly demanded some guarantees from the United States and from Russia that Russia will not breach our sovereignty, our borders, and so on, because already the issue of Crimea appeared in 1993 when Yeltsin moved tanks to the streets because Parliament decided that Crimea belongs to Russia already in 1993. So it was already the case when Ukraine was seriously worried for its territorial integrity. And of course, the United States could never give Ukraine any guarantees. But because Ukrainian parliament said that we should have something or it will never move forward, and the Ukrainian MFA was transmitting the signal, as I understand, the American lawyers, they suggested the other mechanism, the mechanism of assurances instead of guarantees. And the assurances, this is a political confirmation that everything will be okay, everything will be respected, followed, and so on. However, because Budapest Memorandum has different copies of translation, it has the English copy, which the Americans are following, and the UK. Also, they have Russian language and Ukrainian language copies, where assurances are translated as guarantees. This is why when our Ukrainian diplomats came to the parliament with this copy of the Budapest Memorandum, it was said that it was written there in Ukrainian, and even one could check in Russian, that Ukraine received guarantees from the United States that our security will be taken care of. And what also sounds weird, but it took place that Budapest Memorandum for Ukraine, it substituted the whole notion of deterrence in any shape, because in the military doctrine of Ukraine, even 2012, There was the idea that in case if conflict erupts, our main code of conduct will be referring to our guarantors on the Budapest Memorandum to take care of the situation and to protect us. So we actually didn't do anything to boost our security. We didn't do anything to enhance our security. We were relaxed, because most of the society and most of the political circles were sure that we are secure in the hands of such important guarantors as the United States, and of course that also Russia gives us some guarantees. For Ukraine, taking critically, it was the only choice to join the democratic community of states, because otherwise Ukraine was banned and blocked by the United States from doing that. And because biggest idea was to join to the world family of states, then to give up nuclear weapons was a very logical step. And because nobody really ever identified Russia in the big scale with a general threat to Ukrainian security, it went on smoothly, and Ukraine was pretty happy that it has joined the NPT and pretty fond of its decision, and there were no objections inside the country. Because I think here I can even cite President Kravchuk, which in 1993, he was giving the interview to the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, and he said that Ukrainians and Russians never raised weapons against each other and will never do that. Living for 300 years together, they never had wars and they will never do. Unfortunately, he was politically very blind and could not foresee what will happen next.
I'm Darya Dolzikova. I'm a senior research fellow in the Proliferation Nuclear Policy Program at the Royal United Services Institute. I work on a range of issues in the nuclear space, with a large part of my time taken up by questions of nuclear non-proliferation, increasingly also questions of strategic stability and nuclear deterrence in the European context, but also I've spent a lot of time over the last few years looking at the state of Ukraine's nuclear program, and in particular, the safety and security of Ukraine's nuclear installations in light of the war against Ukraine by Russia.
Since the Russian full-scale invasion, debates have resurfaced about Ukraine's nuclear past and how it came to relinquish the Soviet nuclear weapons on its territory in 1994. Our guests also discussed the role of nuclear weapons in the war in Ukraine today.
The nuclear shadow has hung over the war in Ukraine since the very start of the invasion. Russia is a massive nuclear power, and Putin has made that very clear from the very start of the invasion, that Russia would not hesitate to resort to the full scope of its capabilities, which of course include a very large nuclear arsenal. There is a bit of a debate over the extent to which concerns over Russian nuclear use, or an escalation at least in Russian nuclear threats, how much that impacted on both the scale and the speed of the Western support for Ukraine. So every time that the Ukrainians asked for more and more advanced systems to support them, the support came arguably slower than the Ukrainians would have liked. And I think it's very valid to consider to what extent did the concern over the potential escalation from the Russian side to potentially eventually resorting to nuclear weapons, how much that actually tempered the response and slowed the response from the West. Now, I think within there's lots of things to debate, and I think it'll be for archivists and decades to come to figure out how much of the concern over nuclear escalation and Putin's nuclear coercion, how much of that actually impacted on Western states' decision-making. I think there are other factors that played into that as well. Political factors, economic factors, own national defense factors, our ability to produce some of these capabilities at scale. That will have played into considerations as well. And then on the flip side, it's been interesting to observe the development of Russian reliance on nuclear threats and nuclear coercion over the course of this conflict, and how those threats and that coercion appear to being used to backstop concerns over shortages in conventional capabilities. Perhaps the clearest example that we are now aware of in the public domain was in October 2022, when the Russian military was facing quite significant losses and pushback in Ukraine. And apparently we now know, although we don't have all the details, that there was some kind of sign that the US intelligence community had picked up on that seemed to indicate that there was perhaps some more serious thinking within the Russian system on the potential use for nuclear weapons to backstop those conventional setbacks, presumably. Again, we don't know the details of what happened, certainly not in the public domain. Thankfully, it never got to that. But I think it certainly was a wake-up call for us working in the space of the continued salience of nuclear weapons in Russian thinking. And we saw that again with the changes in the Russian nuclear doctrine and the lowering of the threshold for nuclear use in the Russian doctrine. From the perspective of the development of Russian nuclear thinking and strategic thinking more broadly, I think the Ukraine conflict, I wouldn't say that it's shifted Russian thinking fully. I think it's exacerbated some existing trends in Russian concerns over, for instance, second strike, survivability of its strategic deterrence and of its second strike capabilities. We've seen, I think, the exacerbation of some of those trends that were already emerging prior to the conflict.
There are a lot of speculations what would happen if Ukraine had nuclear weapons. And personally myself and also some of my colleagues also even said that probably a hypothetical existence of nuclear weapons in Ukrainian hands would never prevent Russia from annexation of Crimea because it was made with a very hybrid methods and through the referendum on independence and so on. But I would say that I'm pretty sure that having nuclear weapons, Ukraine would avoid the scenario of 2022 when Russia just directly attacked Ukraine, like the full-scale invasion, because Putin is such a leader, which is very cautious. He has been incredibly cautious in waging wars only with the weaker enemies. He was waging Chechen wars, he was waging wars in Georgia, and then Ukraine looked very easy as a victim. And this is why, of course, if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, he would have very different considerations. And that would probably never happen. The question, of course, that Ukraine could never probably retain nuclear weapons, but hypothetically, if Ukraine was a nuclear country, it could never happen. So we see a very strong influence of nuclear element in the Russia's war on Ukraine. And this very strong element also was reflected in the autumn crisis of 2022. Before I will speak about this autumn crisis, I would like to say that the 21st of February 2022, when Putin attacked Ukraine, he had a televised speech where he said that whoever interferes in this conflict will have the unprecedented consequences. And that was a very strong nuclear hint. And then in March 2022, President Biden released the tweet that the United States would not permit Russia to touch any part of NATO territory, but we are not going to wage Third World War because of Ukraine, which actually showed the most vulnerable spot of the United States and the most vulnerable spot of the Biden administration, the fear of nuclear war, which Putin and his administration used with a great pleasure, because if somebody says, I'm afraid of that, then of course you'll be the fool not to use this fear. And this is why Russia's war has been accompanied by a very strong nuclear messaging. I think that together there were 136 nuclear signals coming from Russia during the war. However, only one nuclear signal turned to be very serious. Many analysts are coming to the agreement that, yes, that Russian nuclear coercive signals have detained the supply of ATACMS to Ukraine for at least a year or a year and a half. But besides that, in autumn 2022, when Ukraine started its counteroffensive operation, there was about 30,000 of Russians gathered in Kherson, and they had to withdraw from Kherson, crossing the Dnieper River. And they could be very vulnerable while crossing the Dnieper River, and they could receive a very strong defeat from Ukraine. And simultaneously, the American intelligence gave the American president the information that the amount of nuclear conversations about the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine has tremendously increased in Moscow and in Kremlin. And this is why Biden administration started this private signal communication with Putin and his administration. And as a result, there was a range of signaling sent to Moscow. However, it was not that easy because it was the whole month, starting from the end of September up to the end of October, which was full of very strong persuasion. And at the same time, it was not that easy to stop Russia from pressuring, because when the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin sent very strong message to Russian Minister of Defense Shoigu, And he said that Ukraine is not our vital interest, but in case if you use nuclear weapons, it will immediately become the vital interest of the United States and will start using all the measures we're restraining from, even involving some conventional things. Also, he said that it will become the matter of global importance and Russia will become the world pariah. Apparently, the signal turned to be quite strong to such an extent that in a day, Shoigu called to the United States, UK, France, Turkey, China, India, announcing that Ukraine is already on the final stage of building up of a dirty bomb. And we know dirty bomb is the weapon which is having the conventional explosive, but also it has some radioactive elements inside. So in case if it's exploding, it is dispersing these radioactive elements over the location, and it creates the effect of Chernobyl similar to that. Everybody knew that it's not the fact. But for the United States administration, it was a very big perception that Russia was trying to use that as a pretext for using nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Next day, the P3 sent a very strong message that they don't believe. Also, the IAEA was invited immediately to Ukraine to check all the nuclear sites and had the report that there was nothing found. There were some private communication with Biden and Putin. All the American officials were very much involved. And also even President Biden, he made two very important things from my point of view. First, he sent a very strong hint that the United States would not exclude the conventional operation against Russia. In case of using tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine, also conventional operation together with the UK and France. There was no nuclear signaling, but everyone understands that there is a very big and strong nuclear shadow stands behind the conventional signaling between nuclear weapon states. And also the other was the call to the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, which, according to the intelligence estimates, had a certain influence over the mind of Putin. And Xi Jinping, they say he called Putin, and also India, they released the statements that nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought, which was also a very strong signal that they will never endorse that behavior from Russia. So in the end, nobody knows what happened and what was the main reasoning that Russia didn't use tactical nuclear weapons. But in a week of this rhetoric, Putin gave a Valdai speech and said that Russia never planned to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. And in the meantime, we also know, and this is a very dark part of all this history, because we will never have the direct evidences of that. After showing the opportunities and capabilities, we can see that the political capabilities of nuclear weapons in the Russia's war in Ukraine seems to be enormous, and the role of nuclear weapons seems to be enormous, the role of nuclear deterrence, because nuclear weapons so far has remained to be not the weapon of war, but the weapons of a very strong political blackmail, very strong political pressure.
Polina, Sinovets, and Darya Dolzikova explain the historical context that led Ukraine to sign the Budapest Memorandum.
It was not really possible to behave differently under that circumstances in which Ukraine, for the independent state to found itself in the beginning of 1990s, to stand the pressure of that kind of nuclear superpowers as the United States and Russia, it was not really possible. Of course, it could be nice to have a different story with Ukraine, which could retain nuclear weapons, but it is not the real story. And it was practically not possible for Kiev to do that under that circumstances.
The debate over whether Ukraine should have given up the nuclear weapons that were on its territory at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think you'll find that debate has certainly been raised in Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion, since February 2022. However, the sense that I get is that the debate is still on the fringes. I don't think it's a serious consideration for Ukraine to start pursuing a return to nuclear weapons. I don't take any accusations to that end seriously that Ukraine might be considering that, partially because they just don't have the infrastructure to develop those nuclear weapons, even if they decided that they did want them, which I don't think they do. But the question over should Ukraine have given up the nuclear weapons that were on its territory back in the 90s is, I think, a good one. I would argue, and others have argued, that if Ukraine chose not to give up its nuclear weapons, we would be in a completely different universe. Ukraine would have a completely different relationship with the West. Ukraine agreed after the collapse of the Soviet Union to join the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state and to remove nuclear weapons from its territory. Therefore entered the international community as an actor in good standing with the non-proliferation regime. Had Ukraine refused to do that and had it insisted on maintaining its nuclear capabilities that were in Ukraine, I think it would have ended up with a very different relationship with the states that are now its allies. I think it would have ended up in a very different economic situation because it's not cheap to maintain nuclear capabilities and to advance them to the point where the nuclear deterrent actually remains credible. So I think we're dealing with a little bit of a hypothetical scenario in which, again, I think we'd just be in such a completely different universe that I buy the argument fine that perhaps if Ukraine had nuclear capabilities, Russia would not have as readily invaded the country.
Russia has been targeting Ukraine's critical and nuclear energy infrastructure. Darya Dolzikova details the resulting safety challenges.
Nuclear facilities in Ukraine have faced quite significant safety challenges over the course of the full-scale invasion. There are 15 operational nuclear reactors across Ukraine, across 4 nuclear power plants. Plus, there is the Chernobyl facility, so it's the Chernobyl exclusion zone. It contains the remnants of the 4th reactor unit that was destroyed in the accident in 1986. The Chernobyl exclusion zone also hosts both dry nuclear fuel, spent nuclear fuel storage sites and pool-type spent nuclear fuel storage, as well as a highly radioactive nuclear waste repository and some research facilities. While it's not an active power plant, it's still a nuclear facility that requires some care when it comes to nuclear safety and security. So obviously over the course of the war, all of those facilities have faced varying degrees of danger. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the Chernobyl exclusion zone, was invaded on the very first morning of the full-scale invasion. Russian troops crossed over into Ukraine from Belarus, and the exclusion zone is right on the border with Belarus. So the zone was occupied fairly quickly. On the other side of the country in the east, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant was occupied by Russia as of the start of March of 2022, so immediately after the start of the invasion, and it still remains under Russian occupation. The other nuclear power plants across Ukraine have not had to deal directly with the Russian military, if you will, but nevertheless, they have faced their own challenges as a result of the invasion. One of the most critical aspects of nuclear safety is the continued provision of external power to those facilities to make sure that their cooling systems or safety systems can continue to operate well and reliably. And with Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy grid more broadly, that has also caused multiple disruptions to Ukraine's nuclear power plants across the country. So they've lost external power supply multiple times. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, of course, is in the most precarious situation, being quite close to the line of contact. So that facility faces threats of disconnection from external power, but it also has lost its ultimate heat sink, which was crucial for the cooling of the 6 reactors that are at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And that was the Kakhovka reservoir, which was drained and evaporated eventually after the destruction of the Kakhovka dam. There are other concerns over availability of personnel to operate all these facilities, and Zaporizhzhia in particular, the capacity or the ability to provide the maintenance that those facilities need, and other issues as well. In terms of what safety measures have been taken to protect these facilities and to ensure that they continue to operate safely, there's only so much that can be done, really. In the case of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, that facility is completely under Russian control. So it's being operated by a subsidiary of Russia's nuclear state enterprise, Rosatom. The IAEA has a constant presence at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, as they do at Ukraine's other nuclear power plants. So they are there to keep an eye on the nuclear safety and nuclear security of the facility. Now, their access is not complete across the facility. If the Russian operators of the site don't allow them to see certain parts of the facility, then they don't get access to those parts of the facility. And for me, that certainly raises questions over the extent to which they're getting a full picture of the state of nuclear safety at the ZNPP. Another critical role that the agency plays on nuclear safety in Ukraine is the monitoring missions that they've had to the substations of Ukraine's nuclear power plants. So when we look at what the threats to the nuclear safety of those facilities are, of the nuclear power plants, yes, there's always the risk of direct attack on those facilities, but the more likely risk to them is the disruption of the provision of external power and attacks on substations to those facilities. So the fact that the IAEA is keeping an eye on those substations is quite critical from a nuclear safety perspective. Then there's also, of course, efforts like with other critical national infrastructure across the country and other key infrastructure across the country to maintain the safety of those substations and to defend those substations. Obviously, just broad air defense is going to come into play on that, but there's also been some efforts to bolster the physical protection of those substations, to build some kind of defenses around them. So that in and of itself is a nuclear safety effort, if you will, as well.
Our guests conclude the episode with their perspectives on lessons learned from Ukraine's nuclear past and present.
The international historic case of somebody having the biggest nuclear state as a neighbor, also the nuclear state who has always been quite aggressive and expansionist, to give up nuclear weapons in this situation is a very strong lesson, what one should not do. And I'm afraid that Russia's war on Ukraine has proved that nuclear deterrence matters, not because nuclear weapons are usable, and they are not usable as weapons of war, otherwise the humanity would just demolish itself. However, they present very strong, powerful instrument of impunity. It can cover conventional aggression. Under the umbrella of this nuclear shadow, you can perform any aggression against your neighbor without being punished. You can do whatever, you'll survive, because nobody will really interfere in this conflict. And this is a main lesson that probably the Ukrainian case of giving up nuclear weapons and then the Ukrainian follow-up experience of Russia's war in Ukraine, where the nuclear shadow is so strong, is very vocal on the necessity of nuclear deterrence. So unfortunately, it gave a very negative lesson to the world security, reminding the essentiality of nuclear deterrence for the states if they really want to remain independent in their decision making, boosting their security in an optimal way. Of course, it doesn't mean that any state should have nuclear weapons because it will bring chaos. But of course, NATO nuclear deterrence is very important for preventing the proliferation trends. And then, of course, all NATO members are very happy to retain under the US nuclear umbrella. The only problem now is that the US nuclear umbrella is questioned. However, ideally, the NATO nuclear umbrella could substitute any independent nuclear deterrences, and it combined the necessity for boosting security and nuclear deterrence with the non-proliferation trends.
So I guess the question is lessons by whom or lessons for whom? I think there are states that are looking at Ukraine's experience and wondering what that means for them in terms of their own nuclear capabilities or nuclear ambitions. The case of Iran, of course, and whether Ukraine's experience has changed Iranian thinking on the value of developing a nuclear deterrent and the value that a nuclear deterrent might have in preventing invasion of its own territory. The case of North Korea and whether North Koreans might be willing to ever give up their nuclear deterrent. I expect Ukraine's experience might have convinced them that might not be the best way to go now that they've secured a nuclear capability. So that's on the nuclear side. On the non-proliferation side, this goes to a broader discussion, but there's also states across Europe and in Asia that largely because of concerns over the credibility of the US extended deterrent that's popping up in a few different corners. I think there's also important lessons to be learned from a nuclear safety perspective when it comes to the safety of civilian nuclear infrastructure. So I'd written a report published earlier this year that looks at trying to understand a little bit better why militaries might either look to intentionally target nuclear infrastructure or why they might end up in a situation where they're having to operate around a piece of nuclear infrastructure, because the threat of the use of military force against nuclear facilities is unfortunately not unique to Ukraine. We've seen historical cases of military attacks on nuclear facilities in the Middle East, of course. Just this past summer, we had the attacks on the Iranian nuclear program. The distinguishing factor there being that those facilities were either clearly not civilian facilities or have very credible and serious concerns over their weaponization potential, whereas the facilities in Ukraine that are at risk from military activity are clearly strictly civilian infrastructure. But I think there are lessons to be learned from Ukraine's experience for nuclear safety more broadly, especially as the global energy production looks towards nuclear increasingly as a sustainable source of energy. And as nuclear power gains in importance in the global energy mix, we can expect to see the construction of new nuclear power plants, including, I would venture to say, in areas of the world where they are either currently prone to conflict or may become in the future prone to conflict. There have been reports of Russian military planning going back to 2014 that included the targeting of nuclear facilities in, I believe it was Japan and South Korea potentially. So we know that critical national infrastructure, nuclear power plants as parts of critical national infrastructure will continue to be a risk for military operations. So the lessons learned are quite broad, and I think there are some practical things around how do we make safety systems more resilient, and how do we make sure there's sufficient power supply? How do we strengthen the physical protections around these facilities and their substations? I think there's some practical lessons to be learned. But I think more broadly, at a higher level, it's just a reminder of the need to think through these things in advance and to make sure that we have plans in place that think through the extent of the threats that nuclear facilities might face in the future and making sure that plans are commensurate to the risk. Most of the nuclear safety and security planning has been done largely around non-state threats to nuclear infrastructure. What happens if a saboteur or a non-state terrorist looks to target nuclear infrastructure? But I think this is a good reminder that we need to look at what are the state threats as well to nuclear facilities. And they will differ from country to country. I think me sitting here in the UK or someone in France or even in the US, the chances of nuclear power plants in those countries facing the same kinds of threats as those that Ukraine has faced from missiles and drones, I would venture to say, and I would hope, are quite low. But have we thought through properly what other disruption might come down on those facilities, including cyber attacks, for instance? So I think it's just a reminder of the need to think through the safety of these facilities from state threats. But again, I think there's more practical lessons to be learned as well. And if anyone can help us develop our own nuclear safety procedures, the Ukrainians have such a wealth of expertise now. And unfortunately, because of the state of things in Ukraine, the continued war, there are a lot of nuclear specialists in Ukraine that might not be employed in their previous positions. Just as Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the staffing numbers there have dropped significantly. And these are all highly trained nuclear specialists. So I think we need to learn how to leverage their expertise as well, especially for countries, again, who might find themselves at risk of attacks on their nuclear infrastructure.
Thank you for listening, our guests for speaking, and the European Union Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding this series. Until next time, stay optimistic.